At independence in 1960, agriculture was Nigeria's economic mainstay. But the discovery and commercialization of crude oil soon transformed the nation's fortunes, making petroleum the dominant source of revenue. 6.5 decades later, Nigeria remains Africa's largest oil producer. Today, as the world pivots to cleaner energy, the challenge before Africa's biggest economy is urgent, diversifying beyond crude oil while reforming the sector to remain competitive. My guest is an energy lawyer and analyst, Dr. Ayodele Oni. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ayodele Oni.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. So, in talking about Nigeria's oil and gas industry, Nigeria's economy has often been criticized for being too dependent on oil. Now, in your own view, what are the key consequences of this over-reliance, and why has diversification been so difficult despite the country's vast resources?
Okay, it's historical. If you were doing something a bit tasking, like agriculture, and you suddenly find something that easily gives you income, it's a Dutch disease, right?
Mm.
Everyone is going to just jump on it and abandon those more difficult things, right? So that's what we've had with oil and gas. We had agriculture. You would hear stories about like other countries, Singapore and co, who were at our level, Malaysia, those who would come take our palm kernels and now sell more crude. The tragedy isn't even in relying on oil that much. The tragedy is more around not adding value to the oil, not refining it until now, not processing our gas until now, just selling the base resource and buying more expensive petroleum products. It's similar to what I was in Geneva. Um, I was in Geneva 2 months ago, and if you see the chocolate wealth in Geneva compared to the poverty you'd find in a place like Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana, where they get the cocoa from, you know that it's really a tragedy in Africa, more so even West Africa, if
Mm.
historically we've just relied on base resources. Because, it's a balance of trade, balance of payment thing. You sell crude or whatever it is of 1 billion and you're buying back finished product of 1.2, 1.3 billion. It means you're in a deficit. You need to look for more money. That's why very often you find out that African countries, their budgets are in a deficit and they don't always have to borrow money. So I think those have historically been the challenges. It's not good news. It's not that much of a sad news to rely largely on oil, but are you adding value to that oil? Are you then exporting the finished products, which will still make you reasonably okay? And countries like Dubai have then invested in tourism, right? I said country, UAE as a country has then looked at tourism, and a few other countries to have used oil wealth to develop other aspects of the economy. It's those things which we have not done that's the problem, more than even the reliance on oil.
Yes, those things that we have not done seems to be the problem because of the reliance of oil, as you have stated in your opening assertion. But looking at all of this, this over reliance on oil has ensured that we have been severely affected by fluctuations in global oil prices. Now, how has this left us vulnerable to price shocks?
Oh, it would always leave you vulnerable to price shocks. Once you rely, you then mean you have a budget deficit. Because if you
Mm.
say, for example, that you want to be able to do 2,006,000 barrels per day, and you expect that oil prices will be, say, 70 barrels or 120 dollars per barrel, and it goes to half of that price, you already have a budget deficit if 90% of your forex is coming from there, over
Mm-hmm.
50% of your revenue is also coming from there. It immediately becomes a problem, right? Because it means that you're going to derive less than half from what should provide you 50%. And those other things you can't really guarantee, right? So it leaves us vulnerable, leaves the economy vulnerable. You can wake up and something that, and there's a good example if you read the gentleman's book I don't want to go into mentioning names and all of that. Um, Oil prices changed and it became broke and it
Yeah.
became bankrupt. Whilst the ship the ship was laden with petroleum products. So that's what happens. So imagine that that's also a country.
Mm.
So those shocks just can get us very poor. See what's happening in countries like Indonesia. So yeah, over reliance just means that international vagaries, international issues just mean that you're in trouble,
Oh,
and even is worse as the world now transitions.
true. Transitions to tech. But what can we do? Have we as a country taken steps to go beyond oil? Like the president has been talking about agriculture, we're talking about now there's a new oil, technology and all of that. Have we taken concrete steps to, or is it showing that the steps we are taking is actually pushing us towards non-oil sector and getting some revenue from there and moving us maybe like 60, 70% away from oil?
Yeah, I think it was worse, right? I think at some point it was 80% revenue, 90% forex. So if it's
Mm-hmm.
50%, it means that there are other things that have come to the fore. I think taxation, I have reservations with some provisions around the taxation anyway, around CGT and a few things that I think maybe would have put more thought into or more consideration. But that said, tax revenue, I think government is doing a bit more around that, encouraging the guys who are doing fintech, encouraging some of that. But you also need to be careful that some of the signals, even around the tax, don't end up scaring people elsewhere,
Mm.
right? The nomads and all of that. Because the world, like you said, data, tech is becoming the new oil. And I think that as a country, we're not doing that badly in terms of the individuals. I think government needs to do a lot around encouraging people in that space, right? Then you see a few non-oil around agriculture. You hear people say they are exporting certain agricultural products outside of the country and are generating revenue. Real estate is gone. Yeah, it's been good. I mean, there have been challenges recently because of fluctuation in forex, which is forex itself has been more stable in the last few months, but prior to that time. But overall, I think we've moved from 90, 80% oil, both forex and even revenue, to if you are doing 50%, it shows that we've made progress. And I think we're the only country in the world that relies largely on one or two items, to be honest. Our
Mm-hmm.
services too are great, right? Consultancies are doing well, whether it's legal consultancy, whether it's tax, whether it's a big four. You see, so the knowledge economy is something I also see that is driving the country. And even for the oil and gas, there's more emphasis on gas, which I think even with transition will still be the transition bus stop. And there are a lot of interesting presidential directives that encourage more people to do gas. But we also then need to be careful around implementation of some of these things because Nigeria's problem usually isn't thought leadership or policies. It's when it comes to implementation. I think those are the issues. So I think that there's much more than oil. And to be honest, I tell people, and I was doing some math, we're not even as rich as we think we are for oil. When you do a per capita, when you do volumes divided by our population, it's probably two and a half barrels per year per person. It's not as great as we think. If we are doing 1,580 barrels, if we did
Okay.
that for last year and
Uh-huh.
divide the population about divided by 237 million to our population thereabout, and the 577 million we do a year barrels by that amount. You find out that we're not even doing up to 3 barrels per person. So we're not as oil rich as we even think, to be honest.
But now we are doing 1.8 million barrels.
Yeah, if you still do that, we're still not up to 4 barrels per person.
Mm-hmm.
If you divide it by 237 million people. So yeah, I was even using last year's numbers, because we're able to determine the entirety of last year, right? So in my own view, we've made progress. We are making progress. Look at telecoms to look at IT, right? We're making progress. We have more people in the formal sector, micro, small, medium scale enterprises. But overall, there's still room for improvement.
Okay, so before I go to my next question, now, with your last statement, overall, there's still room for improvement. What part should we improve? Where should we improve?
I think implementation, I think attractiveness to investors, because at times it still gets mixed signals. Government is saying something, but in reality, those some of the incentives are there, but almost never very difficult to get them. Change in law, signals around, oh, we're going to make modifications to the PIA so soon. And people are like, oh, we've just invested. How do we know that we'll be able to recover our investment? So clarity, certainty, are those things that remain critical. And every now and then you hear that, oh, they put a pause on people who want to export certain agricultural products without going to specific names. You don't want people to think, oh, we plan for something and then we do not we're not able to. We've invested risk capital, we're not able to recover. So those sort of things around implementation, clarity, certainty, and practical reality you find on ground are those things we need to, generally speaking, improve on. And our fiscals, taxes, should we really be increasing taxes like CGT, or should we really be reducing them? Those rates to encourage more people. Those are conversations you should have, because I already hear people speak about moving accounts abroad and making certain changes. If you're going to also be placing surveillance on people's accounts, those sort of conversations. If you look at the tax act, you see some of those challenges. Yeah, you want to increase the tax next, but you then need to be careful that you don't scare people away, particularly maybe the richest people who provide the most jobs, so that they don't then begin to move to Monaco and elsewhere.
All right, so let's talk about one hydra-headed monster that seems to have, at a point, eaten quite deep into the fabric of the oil and gas sector, which is corruption. It's quite a well-known issue with mismanagement and diversion of funds. How can the country address this corruption problem while maintaining investment in the sector?
Okay, I think when it comes to oil and gas, there's a politics of oil and gas, and I'm not sure you can have politics without having corruption. So if you have the politics of oil and gas, I'm not sure you can totally eliminate corruption in oil and gas, but certain things you can do, some of which the president has done with the NNPCL and limiting contracting cycle and all of those to reduce the incidence of corruption. And I think it's done well. There's some movement in the oil and gas space. I think a lot has been doing, particularly in the oil and gas space. But you can't completely eliminate corruption. What you could then also do is to encourage more private sector participation. If you encourage more private sector participation, more competition. Nitel's corruption wasn't fought by law. It was just providing private sector in alternatives that were good, that were efficient, that were excellent. People are going to move. So if you have companies truly compete with the NNPCL, or you ultimately privatize even the NNPCL, put it on the stock exchange, you don't need to make laws for corruption to reduce substantially in that respect. I always think if you reduce human interface with public service too, or public servants, and have maybe tech run it, have private sector consultants who are not even reporting to those civil servants run it, then you can reduce the incidence of corruption. But you can't completely eliminate corruption. Once you have politics of oil and gas everywhere in the world, politics for me can be synonymous to a large extent with corruption. Even in countries where they kill people like China, you'd hear every now and then someone's been sentenced to death and a 2-year reprieve, meaning that they can be committed to life sentence or whatever it is upon showing good behavior. Suggests that it's something we would always have to live with, and it's not a reason for us to not prosper, because there's corruption everywhere in the world. So those are my own views.
All right, so let's look at our oil production and the need for balance, especially as the Niger Delta has suffered significant environmental damage due to oil exploration. Now, how can Nigeria balance the need for oil production with the imperative to protect the environment and improve the livelihoods of affected communities?
Yeah, I mean, some of it has been catered to with the PIA and the trust arrangement. It goes to my initial response around enforcement. There are a lot of rules, there are a lot of laws. But you should just enforce. And I also believe it's not just the stick approach. There's also the carrot approach. some of which is being done. The gas flare commercialization program, where government is giving permits for certain companies to go and take flare gas, which is good. Flare gas is part of that pollution we speak to. So better surveillance. These problems have been historical, so I see that the government is doing a lot, and it's not really, in my view, as bad as it used to be. With that commercial arrangement where people can go and take flare gas, I know of a number of those transactions, so it's not theoretical. In real life, it is happening, and people are beginning to close their deals to do projects where they can take flare gas. So that already takes care of flare gas largely, maybe venting to a more limited extent. And direct individual citizens also need sensitization because they have a role to play, roles to report. You can whistle blow, and government should ensure that you protect the privacy of those people, and maybe even have an incentive where there's a whistleblowing and there's a penalty paid. Maybe that whistleblower should get a percentage of whatever fine that is paid, because it will then encourage more people to do more when they see a corrupt activity, when they say an activity that can pollute the environment. So I think that we're moving in the right direction, particularly in the energy sector, oil and gas in particular. But we can do a bit more. We can think a bit more outside the box and do more.
Okay, so what should be the role of multinational oil companies in Nigeria's oil and gas industry? Now, I ask this question because many have questioned their impact on communities that they are settled in.
Okay, my own view is that their role is just to follow the law. I do not think they are your government. I do not think they should be the ones providing everything you need. They have corporate social responsibility. They have the new arrangement under the PIA where they create trust, and I know of a number of those already being done. It's for the E&Ps generally, actually, even for midstream and downstream. It's not a situation where it's the IOCs only. The IOCs are even divesting from onshore and shallow waters and are going deep offshore, right? So that said, they do continue to have roles, and juniors, the national oil company, everyone does have a role to play in ensuring that they observe the laws in terms of paying their taxes, whatever fiscals, providing corporate social responsibility to the extent required, and generally keeping the environment safe. Other than that, I do not know that they have
But
any obligation. They may have moral, but not
looking at the CSR and the fact that in major communities where they are domiciled, taking oil, exploring oil in those communities, especially in the Niger Delta, right? Many have questioned their impact, saying, what have they done in those communities? How impactful is or has been the CSRs in those communities by the IOCs?
For me, I think the CSR is even more assuation, unless you have legal obligations. I think it's the government's responsibility ultimately, and their governors' responsibilities. You find out that even though they are E&P companies, there are certain fees, rates they still pay for holding property and all of that. There's personal income tax, there's companies income tax. If you pay a lot of taxes already and pay fees and pay royalties, production bonuses, you pay all sorts. It should then be the government's role to use those sums, and the governor's roles to use those sums to better the lot of the people. I do not think it's actually the role of the E&P companies to be your governor, to be your local government leader. I think that Nigerians owe themselves a duty to ask government questions, to hold governors responsible.
Definitely, definitely. But over the years, while the locals have asked government questions, it seems like these IOCs just do their business in those communities and leave them hanging, especially when some Niger Delta communities have to go and they're fishing communities. Yet they go to the river to fish and they don't get anything. Their livelihoods are lost.
You're right. You're right. That's why I say the IOCs, the E&Ps are obliged to comply with our environmental laws, because there are environmental laws to start with. To that extent that they comply with the environmental law, pay their taxes, do the minimal CSR they can do, particularly where they are legally required to do same, then it's fine. Other than that, I think that responsibility, for example, if you pollute the rivers, there is punitive action that should be taken, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then the relevant governmental authority should take that. If it's a fine, if it's clean up, if it's a combination of fines and they also clean up, then that should be implemented or enforced.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
All right.
That if people don't do what they ought to do anyways, you then have to implement it. That's why I said the roles of the IOCs is to comply with the law. So if the law says CSR, then they have to do it. But they then need someone who needs, then we then need someone to monitor to ensure that they fulfill those obligations. So I'm saying it's a two-way thing, right? They have to comply. Government too needs to ensure compliance, and there should be checks and balances.
All right, Dr. Ayodele, let's just hold on. We will go on a commercial break, then when we return, we'll have further discussions on this. It's still Business Nigeria, so we'll take a quick break, and when we return, we'll talk more. Stay tuned.
Brought to you by the National Orientation Agency, NOA.
You're still watching Business Nigeria. Dr. Ayodele is still with us, joining us to discuss Nigeria's oil and gas industry, of course, looking at the Independence Day anniversary that was celebrated yesterday. Dr. Oni, thank you so much for still sticking around and for your thoughts on all of the issues we've been talking about. So while oil has dominated Nigeria's energy exports, there is increasing talk of natural gas as the next big opportunity. Now, I would like to have your take on Nigeria's potential to become a leading player in the global natural gas market.
Yeah, I think we're already on our way to achieving that with government's efforts. 2021 to 2030 is a decade of gas, and I think the year 2020 was the year of gas. So I think that we're well on our way, and this started back as far back as when we had President Obasanjo, when he started to talk about gas, and I think the last 2, 3 administrations have taken it further, and this administration is doing much more. CNG, LPG. It's cheaper. I even have practical experience. I think I do co-own some midstream, downstream assets, and we did a test, and I think we saved 30% in that month or week where we even used LPG, not even CNG, which I also understand is even then cheaper. So I think it is what it is. I think we're making progress. I think with Train 7, with encouraging a number of guys and a number of smaller LNG, mini LNG projects. There are local projects that I am aware of already supplying gas, particularly in the north, and with the AKK gas pipeline. And if we can improve infrastructure already, there's a lot government is even doing with infrastructure. Prior to now, the eastern and the western being the Alps were not integrated. Now there's integration with the OBN, and there's connection to the north with the AKK, which is maybe nearly 90% done. And ultimately, the idea is to be competition to Russia, right? So that we can pass gas to North Africa and ultimately able to supply Europe. So from an infrastructural standpoint, I see that a lot is being done. Maybe this should have been done in large scale over a long period of time, and we couldn't. But I see that the last few years, previous government and this government is doing a lot to improve gas infrastructure, because it's not sufficient to just have gas in situ in the ground and not be able to add value to it, or to only export. So there's a lot of play around domestic market with the GACN, the gas aggregator, playing a mediatory role for domestic gas under the dump gas arrangement, and we have the willing buyer, willing seller arrangement anyways. But beyond that, we also have that arrangement where the gas aggregator can mediate. So locally, a lot is being done. Internationally, in terms of our international play, we're doing a lot to be a major player in terms of being able to sell LNG, LPG locally. The Dangote refinery is also producing LPG locally, So I think we're well on our way to a gas-centric economic growth, and to being able to forge a delicate balance between local gas use and being a major player in the gas industry internationally. So I think a lot is being done, and I see a lot of interesting progress. And everyone would say to you that gas is the bus stop prior to full-on carbon decarbonization and what we call energy transition. So we're well on our way.
All right, but looking at the gas sector, um, many are still hinged on petrol, and it seems like it doesn't really, we haven't really bought over this issue of having, especially with CNG vehicles now. You still see petrol vehicles on our streets. You see that there are less CNG fuel stations, CNG stations, regassing stations in the country, in states, and all of that. How long do you think, well, I'm not asking that you predict anything, but how long do you think we will catch on this issue of CNG for vehicles?
Yeah, well, everywhere else in the world, I mean, a few places have, like, I think I was in Denmark recently, and it appeared that about 80% of public transport, or even 90% of public transport, was even electric vehicles, but a lot of their public transport was CNG. So I think that it would take a while because infrastructure needs to come on stream. We need a lot. We need to spend a lot annually. But do we have that to spend annually? But you see progress already, right? And I think it will work hand in hand with electric vehicles. I'm sure even you see more electric vehicles on our roads now. So it work hand in hand with EVs. A number of clean tech companies are coming on stream, and there is financing and there is support from government, and there are incentives like import duty exemption for bringing in some of those equipment. So government is doing its own bit. It's just for the private sector to latch on and have more CNG stations for people to refuel. I think it's largely a private sector, to be honest. I think it's largely transport public sector thing more than private sector guys. Because once oil prices go down, people are not keen to convert their vehicles to CNGs. But for public transport, you see a lot of that, buses and all of that. And that's what I've seen elsewhere in the world. That it's largely public transport, taxis, buses, maybe even rail that will be, and that probably 20-30% of the entire transport system, maybe a bit more. For private people, I'm not sure it will grow that fast, that quickly. But for public transport, I think that I see some progress, much more than many people see or note. And it's like elsewhere in the world, where it's largely public transport than private sector.
All right, so let's look 20, 30 years into the future. What do you think will be the role of oil in Nigeria's economy? Now, will the country remain an oil powerhouse, or will it evolve into something else entirely?
Well, we didn't stop having. It became the Stone Age not because we stopped having stones, right? We moved away. There was still stones. There still are stones. We would still maybe have crude oil, but in 30, 40, 20, 30, 40 years, you probably see more EV charging stations, maybe some gas stations, but very little around oil. That's 20, 30 years from now. But I think oil will still play a role, but not as substantial, not nearly as substantial as it is today. Maybe gas will nearly go neck and neck with electricity, EVs, and all of that. But I think it will be EVs first, or electricity generally first, gas then oil. Many people probably mix and match. Maybe have one or two vehicles, electric, one vehicle, internal combustion engine, which may then be CNG, which may still even be fuel. But I think that its power, its impact will win. Will not be totally out, but will win.
Okay, so on a final note here, if you could push for one major reform in Nigeria's oil and gas sector right now, what would it be, and how would it change the country's economic trajectory?
See how we can denominate domestic gas sale in naira largely, maybe also even price in naira for domestic utilization. Yeah, I mean, to the extent possible, that's something I will want to push for. Yeah, around gas, and also maybe even leave not determine gas prices locally. Let it be demand and supply. Yeah, and one thing I also want to do, so maybe I've said more than one, around the PIA, reduce government's backing rights. You know, maybe 10%, maybe 20%, but not the, I think, 50% or so that I say that they can, or 60. I don't remember the exact figure, but it's clearly the PIA. So because they will encourage people that for you to think government can just come in when they are back into my assets. Maybe those are three things I will do.
Dr. Ayodele Oni, thank you so much for talking to us. Of course, you have been a great host, a great guest, actually. Of course, he's an energy lawyer and an analyst. Dr. Ayodele Oni, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, it's now time to review trading activities at the Nigerian Exchange Limited. And with me is